military personnel, maintaining an ongoing effort to discredit any UFO research. Let's take a look now at two very credible researchers as they were interviewed by PM Magazine in Salt Lake City.
People are being used for food. The aliens are eating us. They're experimenting with us. Horrible, unspeakable experimentations.
John Lears is an unbelievable story. He's certain that we have been invaded by an alien culture, that they are experimenting on us, and that the U.S. government knows about it. In fact, it's their most guarded, top secret. It all began on a hot July night in 1947, when, according to Lear and others, an alien craft crashed on a remote ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. Eyewitnesses, the local papers, even the first military men at the site reported a crashed UFO. Then, suddenly the top brass swarmed to the site. Witnesses were sworn to secrecy, and every speck of debris was literally vacuumed from the dusty desert floor. A news story was issued. It, said military officials, was nothing more than a crashed weather balloon. William Moore has written a book on the Roswell incident.
We know that it was not a weather balloon. The people who gave out that story have since come forth and said it was nothing more than a fabrication to get the press off their backs. The evidence suggests it was a spacecraft, and the evidence suggests the government grabbed it and carted it away and is still involved with the examination of it.
Now just imagine that the people that are responsible for our government looking at this thing and also realizing that only 9 years earlier in 1938, thousands of people had been panicked by the H.G. Wells presentation of War of the Worlds. And just imagine what these people thought when they were faced with this, the reality of the thing. It was just absolutely important, of just absolutely world-shaking, earth-shattering importance. This thing be kept secret forever and ever.
In fact, government documents unearthed via the Freedom of Information Act suggest that both craft and alien bodies had been retrieved. However, references are vague, and large portions of the text have been censored. What is known is that in 1947, the United States Air Force began a series of codenamed projects set up to monitor UFOs.
The truth of the matter is, since 1947, we have collected and have in our possession at least 30 to 35 extraterrestrial flying saucers. We have collected and have in our possession at least 100 to 150 alien bodies representing at least 3 different species that people are being abducted at an unprecedented rate.
Lear goes so far as to claim that the U.S. government has established communication with this alien power and actually collaborated with them. We have even built underground research facilities in top secret areas to house their little gray scientists.
The ones that I know for sure that exist are the ones in Nevada at Area 51. There is a underground alien base there. It's our nation's most secret operational facility, and that's where they fly the extraterrestrial craft out of.
Now, says Lear, they have run amok. They are out of control, and they are not benevolent. Our government realizes it made a horrible mistake and can do nothing about it. Moore believes that it's not the aliens, but John Lear who's run amok, and he's outraged by his stories. Moore himself has spent years carefully and meticulously researching the UFO phenomena, proving he believes that UFOs exist, visit Earth regularly, and our government knows about it, and for unknown reasons is maintaining a massive cover-up. Stories like Lear's, he says, only discredit the truth.
John Lear called me up one time and was absolutely certain that he was about to be captured and eaten by aliens.
All I can say is my sources go right to the very top, and if it were not true, I would not be risking my credibility and my life to come forward with this information.
There is no doubt that Lear understands the inner workings of the U.S. intelligence community. He's the son of late aerospace pioneer Bill Lear, and for years flew covert missions over Laos for the CIA.
He has done nothing but collect the most outrageous rumor mill stories that are floating around on the grapevine.
Bill Moore is one of the most hardworking, credible people in this UFO field. He has probably done more to expose the cover-up than any other single individual.
But, says Lear, Moore may be working with the government and only exposing parts of the truth, parts aimed to mislead the truth seekers.
All of which is totally false.
Alien invaders, government agents, secret informants, hoaxes or scams. A cover-up like no other? Is this science fiction at its finest or reality beyond our wildest imaginations? Has John Lear stepped off the deep end?
It's not important that you believe this now, but to file it away for future reference in a month, a year, maybe 2 years. You look back on this when the truth finally gets out and you'll say, my gosh, the son of a gun was right.
Some startling information posed by top-level researchers. The difference being that Bill Moore, the man with the beard you saw, has admitted to participating in a government disinformation campaign to throw researchers like John Lear off the trail. And we found it kind of interesting in our research. If UFOs don't exist, then why...
It was military-oriented, and the military psych has a very disdain for elected officials. So he's the one that effectively let the reins of power of the executive office slip from the president into the hands of MJ-12, who runs everything now.
Our research team has amassed a mountain of documents that refer to or expressly describe UFO incidents and encounters. Jody?
Headquarters, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, September-November 1980. To whom this is addressed is deleted. It's a request for photographic interpretation by, again deleted, who provided negatives and film. The document describes trilateral insignia known to be on alien devices. Document shows tampering where NSA was changed to NASA before document was released under Freedom of Information Act. Document mentions high-frequency beam pulses and implies that Bennewitz was gaining alien data from these signals.
It all began more than 10 years ago with a man named Paul Bennewitz. Let me preface my remarks by offering the sincere and candid statement that what I'm going to say is, to the best of my knowledge, entirely true. It is offered without malice or prejudice in any way, and is under no circumstances intended to be libelous or defamatory. I genuinely like Mr. Bennewitz, continue to regard him as a friend, and have a great deal of sympathy for the difficulties he's been through. It is not my intention to upset him with these revelations, but rather to add a few facts to a record that's been out of balance for a lot of years. I had moved from Minnesota to Arizona during the late summer of 1979, and as a result had become somewhat closer to Jim and Cora Lorenzen of the old Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, in Tucson. Ultimately, they invited me to become a member of the APRO Board of Directors, and I accepted. It was in this capacity that I first became acquainted with the work being done by Paul Bennewitz and Dr. Leo Sprinkle regarding an alleged UFO abduction involving a young woman and several others which had occurred sometime earlier. The woman had been hypnotically regressed by Dr. Sprinkle and had provided a strange account of having witnessed a cattle mutilation in process, and of subsequently having been taken by her alien abductors into some sort of craft or facility where these aliens were actively engaged in processing fluids and severed body parts obtained from these cattle. During the course of the hypnosis sessions, which began as near as I can recall in August of 1979, Bennewitz had become convinced that the aliens had implanted some sort of communication device in the woman's head, and that they were using this device to control her actions. His theory was that they could actually see what she saw and hear what she heard by means of this device. In any case, Bennewitz, being a physicist by profession and having a certain amount of electronics equipment at his disposal and the wherewithal to purchase more as needed, set out to determine whether it might be possible to detect the electromagnetic signals he believed these aliens must be using to exercise their control over their alleged victims, and to try to devise a way to shield the victim from the control of the signals. He dubbed his effort Project Beta and communicated to APRO in late 1979 that he believed he had succeeded in detecting signals from UFOs and had begun to make calculations about the sort of electronic and propulsion technology employed by these aliens. It was also at about this time that Paul began to take both moving and still pictures of strange lights maneuvering in the vicinity of the Manzano nuclear weapons storage facility, which is located on the east of Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and of which Bennewitz had a perfect view from his residence. Bennewitz was convinced that these lights were UFOs, and that for some reason they were actively interested in both the Manzano complex and the Coyote Canyon test area located directly south of Manzano on the other side of the hills. During this time, the only awareness I had of Bennewitz and his work was what I was obtaining through APRO. I still had not met the man, and in fact was only mildly interested in the case. This based largely upon both Jim and Carl Lorenzen's assessment of Bennewitz as a dedicated researcher, but unfortunately one who was, as Jim put it, prone to make great leaps of logic on the basis of incomplete data. Both Jim and Carl felt that Bennewitz had already decided what he was going to find before he went looking for it. Still, although I didn't come to know about it until a few months later, there apparently was something going on involving UFOs near Manzano, particularly during August, September, and October of 1980. And several agencies of the U.S. government, including the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, seemed more than just casually interested in it. In early September 1980, I was approached by a well-placed individual within the intelligence community who claimed to be directly connected to a high-level government project dealing with UFOs. This individual, who subsequently came to be known as the Falcon, told me that he spoke for a small group of similar individuals who were uncomfortable with the government's continuing cover-up of the truth, and indicated that he and his group would like to help me with my research into the subject in the hope that I might be able to help them find a way to change their prevailing policy and get the facts out without breaking any laws in the process. I knew I was being recruited, but at that point, I had no idea for what. In any case, I was told that if I was interested in cooperating with their group, I would further be contacted by a liaison man, and that future meetings between me and the Falcon would be arranged by this person. The liaison person who subsequently made contact with me was AFOSI agent Richard Doty, a man who has since become quite controversial in his own right, and who many people have mistakenly assumed is the Falcon himself. The story of my contacts with the Falcon, Doty, and subsequently a number of others is something I will have considerably more to say about at a later date. I'm fully aware that such a course of action will undoubtedly prompt the gossip mongers to begin circulating an entirely new array of outrageous and unsubstantiated rumors, but so be it. My purpose here is to deal only with that part of the story which is directly connected to the Bennewitz affair. To those of you who want to know more after hearing what I have to say tonight, I counsel continued patience. You have my assurance that the rest of the story will ultimately be told as well. But before going back to the Bennewitz affair, let me make several points which seem appropriate at this juncture. First of all, on the question of Richard Doty and the Falcon, it's important to note that the name Falcon was invented by my partner Jamie Chanderet and I in 1984, strictly as a way of facilitating our talking to each other about this person, particularly on the telephone, without having to use a name. Richard Doty, who continued to be liaison man, was similarly referred to us, or by us, as the Sparrow. Neither Sparrow nor Falcon were aware that we were using these terms in reference to them, nor was anyone else, to the best of my knowledge, prior to about mid-1985. It was in mid-1987 a pawn in a much larger game, just as I was. As for Bennewitz, by 1981 he was gathering data from a variety of sources and amalgamating it with information being fed to him by a number of government people in whom for some reason he seemed to have an implicit and abiding faith. The story that emerged from this melange of fact, fiction, fantasy, hearsay, hard data, and government disinformation was absolutely incredible. Yet, somehow, Paul believed in it and set out on a one-man crusade to tell the world that malevolent aliens from space were in league with our government to take over the planet. What had begun in 1979 as an effort to learn whether the behavior of a woman who claimed she had been abducted by UFO aliens and was being influenced by some sort of radio remote control had, in the space of less than 3 years, blossomed into a tale which rivaled the wildest science fiction scenario anyone could possibly imagine. Basically, it seemed to me that Paul was his own worst enemy. Instead of withholding judgment until all of the facts were in, Paul insisted on repeatedly going off half-cocked to virtually anyone who would listen. Members of the press, other UFO researchers, U.S. congressmen and senators, people in military command positions, members of the scientific establishment, even the president himself, all were members or subjects of Paul's efforts to reach out and tell the world what he sincerely believed to be happening. He wrote letters and made phone calls by the hundreds. And to those who had neither the time nor the inclination to look behind the words for a better understanding of the facts, Paul, with his professional credentials and technical vocabulary, came off as a rather credible individual, which must have caused quite a rash of headaches among the people in high places who were desperately trying to defuse him. The idea that UFOs had something to do with the phenomenon. Number two, an increasing number of UFO cases wherein the individual or individuals involved claimed to have been abducted by UFO aliens and taken aboard their craft against their will. Public exposure to this phenomenon got a big boost in 1981 with the appearance of Bud Hopkins' bestseller Missing Time, and Paul was particularly interested in these cases. His hypothesis that people were being abducted, implanted with some kind of alien control device, and then being let go again was completely consistent with the thinking of a number of other UFO researchers at the time. Paul's hypothesis, however, had a somewhat more sinister spin than most. Third, his own experiments and research regarding the radio signals he was receiving and the photographs and film footage he was getting of unusual lights. Both of these phenomena seemed largely, though not entirely, connected with goings-on within the Kirtland Air Force Base Sandia National Lab Complex just south of Albuquerque. There is no question that Paul was receiving some sort of electromagnetic signal on his equipment, and it is equally certain that his photos and films do depict unusual lights, most of which were filmed while hovering or maneuvering over the Kirtland Sandia complex. The real question here, however, is whether Paul's evidence is sufficient to conclude that either of these phenomena was directly related to UFO activity, or whether in fact a prosaic explanation exists which is more directly related to some classified government project. Admittedly, strong arguments can be made in both directions, either one of which can be offered as an adequate explanation of the government's counterintelligence activities in this case, which was the fourth factor. Government surveillance of Paul and his activities, some of which Paul was astute enough to detect and some of which I had learned about but Paul seemed unaware of. Paul took the surveillance activities, which included wiretaps and, according to Paul, even break-ins, as proof positive that he was onto something big. Unfortunately, he seemed largely unaware that the same people who would go to such lengths to spy on him also had the capabilities to mount an effective disinformation campaign. In any case, by mid-1982, Paul's story contained virtually all of the elements found in the current crop of rumors being circulated around the UFO community. There were two groups of aliens, one malevolent, one more friendly. The malevolent ones, which Paul referred to as the Greys, were really in control. And they were the ones responsible for the cattle mutilations, for human abductions, and the implanting of sinister control devices in humans, for having first made and then broken a secret treaty with the U.S. government, for maintaining a secret underground base under Archuleta Peak near Dulce in northwestern New Mexico, and for having supplied the U.S. government with alien space hardware and weapons which ultimately proved defective or which were caused to crash, thus leaving human civilization virtually defenseless against invasion. According to Paul, an atomic-powered spaceship which they had given to the U.S. had been caused to crash on Archuleta Peak near the entrance to an underground alien base, and had sprayed the entire area with radioactivity and wreckage. To prove it, he provided drawings which he said he had made from photographs. I and others who examined Paul's photographs as well as independently obtained pictures of the same area were unable to see what Paul claimed was there. Where he saw a crashed ship, burned wreckage, entrances to the alien base, and weapons pointing skyward, others could only see rocks, trees, and shadows. I have no doubt that Paul believed that he saw what he claimed, and for this I offer no explanation. I only know that what he claimed to see wasn't what others saw. There is no question that some of Bennewitz's pictures are interesting, but I must say that even though I viewed a large number of them, I never saw one that I could get particularly excited about, and I certainly never saw anything that I felt could be pointed to as proof positive or even compelling evidence that he was photographing alien spacecraft. Much of his film was Super 8mm, which is too small a format for good quality enlargement. There is also no question that Paul was intercepting some kind of low-frequency electromagnetic emission. The question was and remains, where was it coming from? What was its purpose? And indeed, most importantly, was it UFO related at all? Paul, at least, was totally convinced that he was receiving alien radio transmissions, and had even gone so far as to develop a home computer program capable of translating them into English. The problem, as I saw it, was that his program, which he told me had been developed with the assistance of the aliens themselves, assigned entire words, sentence fragments, and sometimes even entire sentences themselves to the various individual pulses of energy within these transmissions. The technique involved was such that it could just as easily have been adapted to assign similar alien translations to the various energy pulses found in ordinary Morse code. I have a number of Paul's computer printouts which contain translations of those allegedly alien messages. If one breaks these apart into their component words, sentence fragments, and sentences, and then shuffles the components, the result is such that the new message says virtually the same thing as the old one. The messages look fascinating until one examines the method by which they were derived. After that, they are not nearly so interesting. Unfortunately, lots of people saw the messages. Very few had the opportunity to examine the computer program which generated them. Along these same lines, at least some of the things Paul was seeing and identifying as alien spacecraft were definitely not UFOs at all. One evening while visiting him, we went out on his sun deck just at twilight, and he pointed out a series of lights slowly maneuvering far out over the West Mesa, perhaps 25 or 30 miles away. These, he said, were alien craft involved in abducting people and implanting them. There certainly were lights maneuvering out there, but even through good binoculars, they were not readily identifiable. Paul insisted they were UFOs and showed us how to conduct a little test with our binoculars, which he said would prove it. Interested, but unconvinced, I drove directly to West Mesa immediately after leaving Paul's home and parked my car at a spot where I felt I would be able to get a good look at anything flying around that area. Sure enough, helicopters carrying large searchlights began to maneuver slowly over my vantage point, only moments after I arrived. One went directly over me at an altitude of about 300 feet, and there is no doubt that it was a helicopter. The next day I called Kirtland, and they confirmed to me that there had indeed been a search and rescue training mission in that area the night before. Such operations, they informed me, were conducted over that area quite frequently. That was in 1982. 2 years later, in 1984, Paul was still making the same claims about these maneuvering lights to other UFO researchers. As far as I'm aware, I was the only one who took the trouble to check. Paul is a convincing and compelling individual in person. He talks an excellent story, and it's easy to see why so many people have been so intrigued by it over the years. Unfortunately, too many of the people who have interviewed Paul have chosen to draw their conclusions about him based solely or largely upon what he says, and not upon the entire body of evidence presented by the larger picture of the case itself. I, too, have spent considerable time with Paul over a period of years and came to know him quite well in that process. As already stated, I viewed a large number of Paul's films and photographs. I carefully examined satellite and aerial survey photographs of both Archuleta Peak and Mesa, as well as aerial photos of the area taken by Paul himself. I examined the computer program Paul was using to decode the alleged alien radio transmissions and communications, and I had a lengthy discussion about this matter with the late Dr. Alan Hynek, who had also independently examined Paul's program. I spent considerable time discussing the affair with both Jim and Cora Lorenzen, both of whom were quite skeptical of it. And I have copies of many of the reports and letters Paul submitted to APRO beginning as far back as September of 1979. Moreover, as I have already stated, I was personally aware of the intelligence community's concerted efforts to systematically confuse, discourage, and discredit Paul by providing him with a large body of information on the subject of UFOs, the malevolent aliens who allegedly pilot them, the technology they employ, and the underground bases they supposedly possess and occupy. The entire story of a secret treaty between the U.S. government and the aliens, of exchanges of technology between us and the aliens, of battles between aliens and American armed forces, and of aliens allegedly having implanted hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of human beings for the purpose of taking over the world and using us as cattle or slaves, came about as a result of the disinformation process. I know, because I was in a position to observe much of this process as it unfolded, and I was providing regular reports on its effectiveness to some of the very people who were doing it to Paul. And I can tell you that it was effective, because I watched Paul become systematically more paranoid and more emotionally unstable as he tried to assimilate what was happening to him. He had guns and knives all over his house. He had installed extra locks on his doors, and he swore that they, meaning the aliens, were coming through his walls at night and injecting him with hideous chemicals which would knock him out for long periods of time. He told me he had no idea what they were doing with him after he was knocked out. He began to suffer increasing bouts of insomnia. Others took over the day-to-day operation of his business as he went through this. One day, I watched him eat not a bite of his lunch while he chain-smoked 28 cigarettes in 45 minutes. I knew at that time that he was not far from an inevitable nervous collapse. His health had deteriorated. He had lost considerable weight. His hand shook as if from palsy, and he looked terrible. I tried to counsel him to drop the entire UFO thing before his health was completely destroyed. He said he knew things were getting bad and he was trying to cope with it. Not long afterward, I heard he had been hospitalized and was under psychiatric care. Whether UFOs were actually ever involved with all of this and to what extent, I never really knew. Perhaps Paul had merely stumbled upon signals generated from some sophisticated high-level government project whose security people had hit upon UFO-related disinformation as their ultimate cover. Or perhaps he had discovered a real, although somewhat less sensational government UFO project, if that's possible, which elected to disinform him to protect what they were really doing. I do know from firsthand experience that there was a tremendous amount of government disinformation involved, and that a large proportion of what we are hearing today about malevolent aliens, underground bases, secret treaties with the U.S. government has its roots firmly planted in the Bennewitz affair. Stories of an alleged UFO crash at Aztec, New Mexico are also a part of this picture, but I'll save comment on that until later in this paper. In any case, from what I knew of all of this, its purpose was strictly to discredit Bennewitz and nothing more. What amazes me is that nearly a decade later, these same stories continue to circulate. Recently, one of the most prominent figures in the current disinformation wave, which has been sweeping the UFO community, was quoted as having stated that he found Paul Bennewitz's information to be 100% true. This person spent a couple of days talking to Bennewitz back in the summer of 1987, and he has spent considerable time since spreading elaborate and increasingly sensationalistic stories based, he claims, on information gathered from a variety of unnamed sources. Strip away the fluff, and what you have left is essentially the Bennewitz story all over again. There is no question in my mind that it's mostly disinformation, pure and simple. And since I know that connections exist between those who are spreading it now and those who were spreading it then, both from the Bennewitz angle and from within the intelligence community, it seems reasonable to conclude that those responsible for it are not satisfied their task has been completed even after all this time. Knowing what is going on, however, is simply not enough. The real question is why. It was just that question I asked myself when I first ran into the disinformation operation that was being run on Bennewitz. It seemed to me at that time that I was in a rather unique position. There I was, with my foot literally in the door of a secret counterintelligence game that gave every appearance of being somehow directly connected to a high-level government UFO project. And judging by the positions of the people I knew to be directly involved with it, definitely had something to do with national security. There was no way I was going to allow the opportunity to pass me by without learning at least something about what was going on. Many ufologists have run up against disinformation over the years. Virtually all of them viewed it as a negative process and backed away from it either in anger or disgust as soon as they discovered what they were dealing with. from a point of near insignificance to what has become almost a flood tide. Indeed, many of you in the audience came here tonight looking for answers to questions related directly to that problem. As I have taken great pains to point out, the current crop of disinformation is really nothing new. It's just that a different crop of people are spreading it this time around. I expect that those responsible, not the rumor mongers themselves, but the ones who are feeding them, thought it would work just as well this time as it did last. The one thing I'm sure they didn't count on is that I would tell my story and thus blow their cover. And speaking of blowing cover, speaking of blowing cover, I think it's high time that I tell you what I know about another situation that has found its way into the current crop of UFO disinformation. I offer this not to embarrass the person involved, but rather to shed light on an incident which, by the accounts of it, have appeared recently in a variety of UFO newsletters and at least one new book. Aztec rumor. Rick indicated he knew nothing about the matter and asked me to tell him everything I could. I did so, and as I recall, he took some notes. We discussed a number of other things as well. Some months later, in early 1983, I became aware that Rick was involved with a team of several others, including one fellow from Denver that I knew of, and at least one who was working out of Washington, D.C., in playing an elaborate disinformation game against a prominent cattle mutilation researcher who, at the time, had close connections with a major television film company interested in doing a UFO documentary. Although I was not in a position to know everything about what was going on, I had access to enough of it to conclude that the government seemed hell-bent on severing the ties that existed between the researcher and the film company. My understanding was that because the researcher was known to have close ties to Bennewitz and had exhibited a strong interest in his work, certain elements within the intelligence community were concerned that the story of his having intercepted electromagnetic emissions from the Kirtland-Sandia area would end up as part of the script of a feature film. Since this in turn might influence others, possibly even the Soviets, to attempt similar interceptions, someone in a control position apparently felt it had to be stopped before it got out of hand. In any case, the prime objective of the counterintelligence people who swarmed around Bennewitz between 1980 and 84 seemed to be the maintenance of a high-level security net around the radio signals he was intercepting. I was unable to determine why this was a priority at the time, and I still do not know today. What I do know, however, is that since they couldn't physically stop Paul from intercepting these signals, and since they hadn't been successful in enlisting his voluntary silence, they fell back on a wall of disinformation as the best way to confuse the issue, and ultimately to call his credibility into question. When the filmmaker appeared on the scene, and it looked as if Paul's story might become part of the script, the counterintelligence people simply extended their disinformation activities accordingly. Part of this game involved a meeting between the cattle mutilation researcher in question, Agent Richard Doty, and others at the AFOSI office at Kirtland Air Force Base, wherein the researcher subsequently claimed to have been allowed to view certain purportedly sensitive documents about the government's alleged involvement with UFOs. Part of this material included information about an alleged UFO crash retrieval at Aztec. Richard Doty, who's bound by a security oath, cannot, and I am told will not, discuss this matter, except to say that he broke no laws and gave away no secrets that day. That, insofar as I'm aware, is entirely correct. I, on the other hand, was never required to sign a security oath, and am therefore breaking no laws when I tell you quite candidly that the information which changed hands on that day was directly descended from the discussion Doty and I had had only a few months earlier. I can also tell you that it was a very effective deception, because the researcher involved continues to believe this information and actively continues to try to convince others of its truth even now, more than 6 years after the fact.